Mordhau is in the middle of an identity crisis. Despite the developers' tireless efforts to push updates for the game, the most crucial and important aspects have been neglected. Every day that goes by without significant change, the risk of it leaving a permanent mark increases. Community size will deteriorate and eventually reach a point where the sheer drop-off in player count will be able to sustain the rapid downfall. And at that point, it'll be beyond salvation. The game will be reduced to a woeful memory, an artifact of the past. And who will Mordhau then? In order to fully understand the troubles plaguing Mordhau and what we can do to help it, we first need to understand what sparked the creation of the game in the first place. Let us delve deep into the intricacies of the game, then look at its history and more importantly its source of inspiration. With a bit of luck, we should be able to determine how different aspects of the game interplay with each other, and what pieces, if any, are missing. My name is Barkus, and this is Mordhau's Identity Crisis. What is Mordhau? If you go to the game's official site at mordhau.com and have a look at the FAQ section, the first question at the top of the list is exactly that. To which Tritonian replies, Mordhau is a multiplayer medieval first-person fighting game with a strong emphasis on skill-based competitive play and customization. It features a deep and fluid combat system that allows those that master it to turn into an unstoppable force on the battlefield. A strong emphasis on skill-based competitive play and a deep, fluid combat system. That is what the game sets out to have in its conception back in 2014. It may not explicitly have been an attempt to create a better version of Chivalry medieval warfare, but the developers of Mordhau were definitely enthused fans of it, as they've stated time and time again. Many of its core mechanics were carried over to their new project, mixed with inspiration from other titles like Mount & Blade. Originally the game went under a different name called Project Slasher, planned to be built on the Unity engine as opposed to Unreal Engine 4. Back in those days the team consisted of a mere 2 people, with slow progress as a result. Their work was eventually scrapped in favour of a new but similar project called Mordhau, that took off sometime in 2015. This attracted a handful of new recruits who brought new talents to the fray, and 3 years and a Kickstarter campaign later resulted in the game we see today. What becomes exceedingly clear from having followed this game's development over the years is how much attention they've paid to the fighting mechanics in the game. A lot has happened since the Unity days, tons of things have been tweaked back and forth, added and redacted over the course of the pre-alpha and alpha phase. We saw patch after patch with mechanics adjustments, each another step towards a more thought through and revised slasher. Release was almost postponed as many times as Intel's 10nm process, and many feared it would never see the light of day. Perhaps the most telling sign is how little development the rest of the game received during that phase. We didn't see a hint of Frontline or any other major mode until about a month before release. And just to be clear, this is not a critique. The goal was always to make a polished slasher, and by every possible metric, they succeeded in that respect. But that just begs the question, what the hell did actually go wrong? Tritonian did indeed sort out most of the flaws that plagued Chivalry medieval warfare in the making of their own game, but they also forgot to, or rather neglected to add, some of the key components that made the game so great. Chivalry had 3 vital components that contributed to the replay value of the game. Starting from the bottom, it had character, and I really mean this in the broadest way possible. For starters, one of the good things the game had going for it was the immersion. The 2 factions the game revolved around, Mason and Agatha, and how interconnected they were with the modes and objectives in the game, gave it a very solid and developed feel. Everything you did in the game was put in a larger context, and you never had to question why you did the things you did. It all came naturally. It felt natural. The maps were not so much fields to battle upon, but rather parts of a world waged in war. That continued to interplay really well with how goofy the game really was. Older veterans should be able to recall the Treehouse server, and the mischief and madness that took place there. The spirit of the Treehouse always existed, and continued to live on long after the server went down. It was an intrinsic property of the game. Torn Banner's model and voice design was spot on for Chivalry, and brought tons of extra value to the game. You got the chance to express yourself really well with the tools that were given. And bear in mind that Chiv was just an FPS at its core. Some took to it more than others, and these people were branded role players. We pointed fingers at them and called them out for it. But that was their craft, and truthfully, we all had a little bit of it in ourselves. One of the positive effects this had was it eased new players into the game. They could take it less seriously, fool around, and still feel like they had a place there. Still be able to enjoy it. Secondly, there was the skill ceiling, or more precisely, the lack of one. Personal growth and improvement was essentially unlimited. One could invest thousands of hours in the game and still fall flat before a more talented and experienced player. The combat was for all intents and purposes the core of the game. It gave the competitively minded players incentive and joy to keep on playing and improving and rise to the top of the ranks. But it also benefited the role players, since a high technical skill improved the trolling in the game, by allowing the more experienced players to toy with the rookies in amusing ways. This was also the main thing that the developers of Mordhau picked up on and strived towards recreating. Last but certainly not least, Chivalry had a proper main mode and maps to play it on. I am of course talking about Team Objective. The game substituted this with a handful of other modes like Duel and LTS, and while they too were greatly appreciated by some people, TO was by far and away the bread and butter of the game. As I mentioned earlier, the mode was very interconnected with the lore as well. It made for a very immersive feel. The ingenious thing about the Team Objective mode was that it played to the game's strengths and put emphasis on the swordplay. In essence, this meant that the world was built in such a way that bottlenecked individual skill as little as possible. A good personal performance resulted in success for your team as well, which was extremely motivating. When you think about it, this really comes off as quite important when the combat is what the entire game is built around. Admittedly, Chivalry was not flawless in this regard either, but that is a story for another time. Something all the Team Objective maps had in common, since it was a core part of the mode, was incentive. Every battle was a race against the clock. This may not seem like a huge deal at first glance, but it was. At any given time you always had the incentive to do as much as you possibly could to stop the enemy from advancing. Holding them off until the time ran out would mean you won the game, right then and there. This would be a huge slap in the face for the opposing team and surely indicate a great performance on your part. Likewise, on the attacking side, you lost when the time ran out, and the only way to keep your head above water was to continuously push onward to the next objective and add more time to the doom clock. There was never any time for rest. The objectives were not necessarily complex, but logical for the most part. Everything made sense in the bigger picture. The maps were built to accommodate 12 and 16 player teams, and this had a number of positive effects. Firstly, since most servers were limited to 32 players, the game was easier to run at high frame rates. Since we're talking about an FPS title, this too is worth some consideration. Secondly, the games became a lot more personal and social with a lower amount of players. There were just enough people to make it feel lively, but without running into the trouble of having too many faces to remember. Over the course of a game you had enough time to get to know both your enemies and your allies. It was not uncommon for intimate feuds to develop between players, which made the fights increasingly tense. Moreover, the 24 to 32 player map optimization meant that it was easier to scale down to lower player counts, such as games of just 10 to 20 players. This was important because it made Team Objective a natural choice for competitive games as well, and it was a staple in the small but passionate pro scene. Since the competitive games were reminiscent of the games ordinary people played, they were naturally more interesting and accessible to these players, for the simple reason that things are more enjoyable to watch when they're familiar and understandable, even if you're not very good at the game in question yourself. Lastly, it made for a more seamless transition for aspiring competitive players, since there was no huge barrier between the two worlds. In retrospect, it's only fair to admit that Mordhau got a lot of things right in their attempt to create a better slasher. Combat looks great, mechanics are consistent, customization is through the roof, there's good voice acting, game looks great, and so on and so forth. But we're not here to talk about all that. We're here to talk about the problem. The game has been in development for over 5 years, and while it wouldn't be fair to say that it's already been a year since release, a lot of time has passed. During all this time, tons of effort has been put on shaping and optimizing the combat aspect of the game, and yet here we are, without any mode available that actually accentuates this in a satisfying way. In fact, the selection of modes in Mordhau is completely cluttered. There are way too many to choose from, and none that accommodate the needs that the game itself puts forward. To make this breakdown a little more digestible, let's focus on the two modes presented as main modes by the studio itself, and unravel why they fail at their job. By extension, it should then become clear why the rest of the palette falls short as well. Introduced in the same vein as the game was released to the public, featuring large battles of 48 to 64 players on equally large maps, this mode was originally intended to accommodate the bulk of the player base. For me personally, because I had already fiddled with the game for about 200 hours prior to release, and was no longer in awe of the game in general, the mediocrity of Frontline became blatantly obvious right from the start. Tritonian hasn't done much at all about creating a believable world. This is especially apparent in Frontline, which is entirely based around capturing and holding arbitrary regions of snow and mud that would play no significant role in an actual battle. It is the least innovative game mode imaginable, with the sole purpose of finalizing the game and pushing it to market. The battles generally lack context. All we have to tie it down to are two faction names, the Iron Company and Free Guard, both of which we know absolutely nothing about. The importance of the locations they fight over is completely lost on everyone, probably. Who are these factions? I want to know. I want to understand what I'm doing on the battlefield and what I'm risking my life for. The problem is worsened by the absence of classes in favor of fully customizable mercenaries. This means that there are in fact no soldiers on the battlefield and no one with actual stakes in the pie. It makes everything seem rather pointless. Like, why are we all killing each other? We could just go home to our families. And just to be clear, I don't actually think the decision to opt for extensive customization was a mistake. It clearly enhanced the role-playing aspect of the game. But it did that to the detriment of immersion, and the game does not make up for it elsewhere. You already made the decision to give the two teams names, and you might as well expand on that and give them meaning. Like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be a whole lot. Just something else for me to base my allegiance on, beyond the fact that red is a better color. Frontline doesn't just fail at providing emotional motivation to complete the various tasks put forward by the mode. The entire system is inherently flawed. Victory is achieved by depleting the enemy's tickets down to 0. The drop-off is governed by the amount of capture points your team controls relative to the enemy. In essence, once you've claimed more than half the points, there is no real reason to do anything else. You can sit back and wait for the game to be over. It is going to take a fair amount of time, but that's okay because time spent is the dominating factor when it comes to gold and experience earned. Now, if you were a bold one, you could try to advance further, capture all the checkpoints on the map, and complete the objectives required for a forced victory. But why would you? Why would you abandon your position of power and risk losing it to the enemy when you're already winning? If you manage to do it and end the game quickly, the gold and experience rewarded will be lower than if you had waited until the very end. Granted, on the losing team you do have motivation to take back the objectives you've lost, but by the time you're behind by 300 tickets, it's pretty clear you're going to lose no matter what you do. Even if you manage to level the game out, you're still down so many points by then that you're inevitably going to lose anyway. Thus, there are no huge turnarounds. There is no excitement. The game is built to flow slowly and steadily like syrup, allowing for accurate predictions regarding the outcome of the game at an early stage. This would be great if Mordhau were a stock market, but it isn't now, is it? Right off the bat, Invasion beats Frontline on both of these grounds. It reinstates initiative by working with timers instead of tickets, and constantly forcing the two teams on their toes. There is always good reason to progress on the map and work hard to complete objectives, no matter what side you're on. There is more room for turnarounds, as there is no huge backlog to work through, or shall we say, insurance for the enemy. even if you've been losing for a long time. All you have to do is play better than the enemy, make progress, and there's really nothing stopping you from ultimately winning the game. This makes the game a lot more tense and exciting, and it's a very welcome change. Invasion also improves slightly upon the immersion. The objectives and inherent progression on the maps give the feel that there's an actual operation going on, as part of a greater war. This is definitely an upgrade from the original dull swabbles of mercenaries on Frontline. I would however argue we're still below an acceptable level. With the improvement of Invasion out of the way, let's discuss the remaining problems that both of these modes share. Combat in Frontline as well as Invasion is a watered down version of its full potential. This is particularly painful to admit, because it's actually a downgrade from Chivalry, despite intending to surpass it. I should clarify that it's the implementation of the combat that was better in Chivalry's Team Objective. This does not necessarily mean that the combat experience in Team Objective was better, because the combat mechanics in the games differ greatly. Still, there are similarities between the two games' attempts at implementing the melee combat in larger contexts. Chivalry's problem mainly boiled down to archers, but they were easily removable if one as administrator wanted to, and the maps themselves didn't interfere much with the melee. For all intents and purposes, they were well designed. The Frontline and Invasion maps, on the other hand, bring a plethora of obnoxious tools to the table. Take catapults as an example. Obviously their projectiles cannot be parried. Maybe you're lucky enough to see them coming, but they move fast enough and damage over a large enough AoE that there isn't any practical measure that can defend against them. The catapults are particularly infuriating because their effectiveness isn't affected by the skill of its operator in a meaningful way either. Distances are long enough and travel time high enough that the outcome of every shot mostly is determined through chance. Beyond aiming in the general direction of the enemy, there isn't much more to consider. This is also why team kills are so prevalent where catapults are concerned. Horses. Couch weapons can thankfully be parried these days, but that is at the cost of almost your entire stamina pool, as well as your weapon. If you're in the middle of a fight when this occurs, it most certainly results in your death. That is of course unless your parry gets flinched by the horse's knockback just before their strike lands. Then you die no matter what. As if that wasn't enough, riders are far too protected from people on foot. Horse flinch box is way too large, it makes it almost impossible to strike back. Even if these issues were to be corrected, the horse remains completely out of place in the game's main mode. Cavalry can make for epic battles, but that requires more horses and a shift of focus from the fencing that is normally the core of the game. There is a rough but intriguing example of this concept in my video When Cavalries Collide. Ballistas. This is a slight improvement over the catapult, as it puts more emphasis on the skill of the operator. The projectiles are fast enough that fairly accurate predictions can be made and utilized for taking out enemies and lowering the collateral damage. On the negative side, there's even less you can do against them on the receiving end. You live and die by the operator's ability to successfully hit you, and the contraption results in a flat increase of deaths on the opposing team, regardless of individual skill. Stones and rockfalls. These things also deal AoE damage, and bypass both shields and parries. What's more, they're typically centered around the objectives, essentially forcing players to line up and get hit by them. Climbing up a ladder on Faetora, there is no practical way to defend against them. If you're far enough up the ladder by the time the opponent shows himself, there isn't enough time to fall back down to the ground and move out the way. Perhaps the biggest problem is that they are meant to be used from elevated geographical locations. So even if they in theory could be parried, this would never happen in practice, since there is no cue to look out for. Constantly having to stare at the sky in anticipation of what might fall from there is not only an unrealistic expectation to put on melee fighters, but also a bad direction for the game to take in general. Nobles. Don't get me wrong here, I firmly believe these guys should be stronger than normal units on the field. But the approach the studio went with, in order to accomplish this, leaves a lot to be desired. It is inconceivable to me why the nobles have had the flinch mechanic completely removed. This might be the most fundamental and important mechanic of the game. Without it, we may as well be playing Skyrim instead. That is not a game you want to be associated with if you put any value into melee combat. Now consider the fact that nobles don't have health regen. This makes chip damage a legitimate tactic against them. All of a sudden everyone is incentivized to gamble. The nobles will gamble because they cannot get flinched, and the opponents will gamble because scoring a few hits here and there over a long enough period of time eventually adds up to a lethal dose and objective completion. And attacks that deal damage through parries? This was added as late as in patch 15. It is scary to see how things not only stay bad, but actually get worse over time. Clearly we've lost track of the concept here. Chivalry did a much better job of this with their kings and generals. By simply increasing the health pool and leaving everything else untouched, higher survivability was still achieved, without screwing up the combat system we know so well and are forced to conform to. Extra health was a powerful tool to those who knew how to fight, and meaningless to those who didn't. The game didn't diverge from the fact that skill was the dominating factor, and it deserves all the praise in the world for that. That brings us to the tools provided by the armory. They may not be exclusive to the two main modes, but they are most prevalent there, and still worth mentioning. Toolkits and firebombs. Many invasion objectives in Mordhau are centered around choke points and bottlenecks. This is not necessarily a bad thing. In theory, bottlenecks are a great place to practice and utilize FTP, precise footwork, and maintain composure for extended periods of time. However, between the wooden spikes, walls and firebombs, players are given immensely powerful tools that work towards slowing down the match, disrupting melee, and putting the entire universe on hold while adding absolutely zero value to the actual gameplay. These things too are great for a laugh the first few times you play, but over time you start to realize that just standing in a doorway, inputting overheads to break down a chain of wooden walls that get repaired faster than you can destroy them, while your feet are on fire, actually is quite tiring, tedious and discouraging. The seas of fire that typically manifest on Grad and Fatora may be slightly less obnoxious, as you don't have to do any work for them to disappear. But they still take a long time to do so by themselves, and there is no apparent reason for them to exist in the first place. Smoke pots obstruct vision to the point where parrying becomes literal guesswork. And don't give me the crap about listening for the grunt, that is part of the equation, yes, but no one relies on it completely. This problem could however easily be fixed by reducing the opacity of the smoke in close proximity. This way, melee combat would be left largely unaffected, while the smoke pot retained its capability to obscure objects from enemies further away. Then we have bear traps, perhaps the most infuriating of them all. Yes, you can crouch walk over them, or run around them, but that implies you see them beforehand, which you do not do. That is the entire purpose of bear traps, to be hard to see and trap unfortunate souls who tread on them. That is how they are supposed to work, and that's precisely why they are a terrible idea in a game like Mordhau, where skill is measured by an individual's ability to react and respond to various types of rapidly flowing information. What is next on the list? Oh. Right. We have to stop somewhere, don't we? In any case, the point is that this crap is what much of these modes revolve around, and it negatively impacts the gaming experience, especially over a longer period of time. Since these mechanics bypass the core defensive mechanisms in the game, they will continue to have the same dampening effect on your performance, regardless of your own personal improvement. They do not inspire development for the player, and impede on the replay value of the game. Frankly, they should not be present in the genre. This brings us to the fundamental idea that a game can be one thing and one thing only. If you grow overly ambitious and add too many components, they will start to interfere with each other. You cannot both appease players looking for strict rules in a competitive environment, and those of more casual inclinations who prefer leaving things to chance. They can at least not be dumped into the same mode. And if both Frontline and Invasion really are built for the casuals, then my question is what everyone else is meant to play. This has strong connections to point number 3, which we just discussed, but plays a couple of other roles as well and deserves its own spot on the list. Simply put, the reason why the decision to focus on 64-player matches has a negative impact on the combat is that it increases the demand on the client-side PCs. FPS titles, such as this one, are really best enjoyed at 120 FPS or higher, and if things drop below that we start running into trouble. As a point of reference, I cycle between 90 and 140 FPS most of the time, on 48 player servers, but I have noted dips below 80 on particularly unfavorable maps with high player counts. That's not okay for a first person slasher. Now it is possible to reach good performance by dropping all settings to low and pixel count to 2 mil, but take note that I am on a 3900X and GTX 1080, and it's reasonable to assume that most players are on much worse systems than this. For them it'll be even harder to achieve. The reason why this is so frustrating is because the game actually is quite optimized, and absolutely could be run at high settings and high frame rate, even on mid-range systems. But because of Tritonian's obsession with stuffing too many players in the same space, this ultimately accounts to nothing. Performance wasn't a problem in the alpha phase, because most games back then were limited to 24 or 32 players, the entire player base of Europe. Increasing the player count has huge implications for performance. It did in Chivalry, it does here, and I'm sure it does in just about every game. I'm not saying we have to go as low as they did, but as it stands right now, even 48 player servers are barely playable, and it would seem an easy fix to just dial it down a bit. I realize it's not as hot for advertising if the game only supports 32 player matches, but in practice the experience can be just as good as with 64, not even counting the vastly improved performance. What it comes down to is whether or not the maps are designed for it, something to consider going forward. Moreover, the large-scale battles and servers contribute to a more solitary gaming experience. Both allies and enemies are hard to recognize, and despite the elaborate customization options, nigh on every player feels like a stranger. They say you're never more lonely than in a crowd, and that certainly rings true in the case of Mordhau as well. Yet another consequence of the 64-player design is that the maps don't work well for competitive games that tend to feature much fewer players. This means you have to do twice the amount of work and create additional maps especially designed for this type of play. Or you could disregard it completely and restrict the competitive scene to games of skirmish. Whew. To my mind, Frontline was a stillborn piece of garbage that should never have seen the light of day. It lacks immersion, tactical incentive, and provides a lackluster melee experience. Even though Invasion was quickly offered as an alternative, Frontline has remained a prominent mode on the official servers. Invasion may be better from a tactical standpoint, but it is still bound to the same flawed base ingredients as Frontline, since the studio continues to push both modes on the same maps. The actual melee combat is mediocre at best, and it is sad to admit for a game that is otherwise so polished in this regard. This does not just leave the casual competitive players unsatisfied, but the professional scene has to look elsewhere to sate its appetite as well. Back when Frontline was the only major mode available, I was of a mind that everything needed to be put in the trash and remade from scratch. Now with Invasion in the picture, that is no longer the case. Well, the maps are still crap, but the mode we can work with. Invasion and Frontline should no longer be related in any way. They should not utilize the same maps or be run on the same servers. Best if Frontline could be discontinued completely, as it is a waste of time and effort to sustain and try to repair, but simply untying Invasion from its older brother will be good enough for now. The future Invasion maps should be made with a smaller player count in mind. They should be large enough to feel like battlegrounds, but small enough to accommodate professional teams, in tournaments and pickup games and so on and so forth. This way the performance issues will be properly addressed, while also giving the comp scene the love it deserves. I pointed out earlier the importance of unity between the casual and competitive scene. That is why I'm not a believer in substitute minigames for professional matches, like Gold Rush. It is too separate from the default game, too niche and hard to get into. For that reason, it'll be much harder to attract an audience for. Almost any big sport in the world is exactly the same if you look at the casual and professional scene. I don't think we should do any different. Sprinkle more story and immersion on the maps to come. Make it a point of consideration during future map design and choice of objectives. Roleplay is a crucial component to any medieval style game, and Mordhau is no exception. Even just a few lines of trivia on the loading screens goes a long way. Megaphone announcements on the battlefield is a classic as well. Lastly, efforts have to be made to double down on the melee experience in Invasion. If not in Frontline, then at least do it here. The combat was what gave Chivalry replay value, and separated it from other indie titles you might have tinkered with for a week or two, and then completely forgotten about. Like Chivalry, Mordhau needs a mode without gimmicks and bullshit if you're gonna have any chance of retaining a player base in the long run. Make it pure and simple and play to the strengths of your game. Then maybe, just maybe, Mordhau will truly be a game that puts strong emphasis on skill-based competitive play, and it will finally have found itself. That's all I've got. Thanks for watching. Burkus out.